Here is something Season 4 of Killing Floor 3 confirmed that nobody has properly talked about yet. The Meyer did not come from Horzine. Horzine did not create it. Moorcroft did not synthesize it. It was not engineered in a laboratory or produced as a byproduct of the same research program that made the Clot and the Fleshpound. The Meyer was already there, waiting, deep beneath the ocean floor, long before anyone at Horzine knew it existed. And once you understand what that actually means, the Dreadzone stops being a mysterious buzzword from Season 4 and starts being the most significant piece of lore this franchise has introduced across 3 games. This is the full story of the Meyer, the oil rig, and the Dreadzone, where the Meyer actually comes from, what the oil rig accidentally discovered, what the Dreadzone is, and what the franchise is implying exists inside it, and why the question of what lives on the other side of that rift is the most important unanswered question heading into Year 2 of Killing Floor 3. If you are new to this series and have never watched any previous video, everything gets explained as we go. Let's get into it. To understand why the Dreadzone changes everything, you need to understand how the Meyer's story actually unfolded across 4 seasons of Killing Floor 3. Because the journey from where it started to where Season 4 left it is one of the most significant escalations in the franchise's history. When Killing Floor 3 launched, the Meyer was presented as a substance. Dr. Emmanuel Moorcroft, Horzine's chief scientist and director of the company's most restricted research division, had been secretly studying and experimenting with on living subjects. He believed it represented the next step in human evolution. His experiments produced creatures that did not exist at any earlier point in the franchise's history. The Scavenger, a pack-hunting creature that cannibalizes its own dead to grow stronger. The Queen Crawler, producing larvae while it hunts. The Impaler, designed specifically to fragment the teamwork Nightfall depends on. The Chimera, the most advanced creation in Horzine's entire history, built from multiple biological sources. Each new creature was a statement about how far the Meyer research had progressed, each one more capable than the last, each one pushing further past what conventional genetic engineering had ever produced. Season 2 brought Nightfall deeper into the investigation. The threat was escalating, and the trail was getting harder to follow as Moorcroft moved his most sensitive operations further from Horzine's main facilities. And then, Season 3 tracked him to Antarctica. Operation Deep Freeze sent Nightfall to the Brunt Ice Shelf, an abandoned scientific research base with an attached dig site at one of the most remote locations on the planet. The description of what Moorcroft was doing there used a word the franchise had never used before. Extra-dimensional, one word, no further explanation. The community debated what it meant for months. Some thought it was cosmic horror. Some thought it meant the Meyer had properties beyond what biology could explain. Some thought it connected to something entirely outside the franchise's established science fiction framework. All of them were partially right, because Season 4 revealed that an oil drilling operation in the North Sea, a completely unrelated commercial operation with no connection to Horzine or Moorcroft's research, accidentally struck Meyer while drilling. That single detail changed everything about what the Meyer actually is. Horzine did not create the Meyer. The Meyer exists in the world naturally, deep enough beneath the ocean floor that a commercial oil drill reaches it before anyone knows what they have found. In a location that has nothing to do with Horzine's facilities, Moorcroft's research, or anything connected to the franchise's established corporate history of building dangerous things in underground labs. The Meyer was there before Horzine found it. Think about what that means for everything we understood about Killing Floor 3's story up to this point. Moorcroft was not developing a new substance in his classified division. He was studying something that already existed, something that predates Horzine, something that predates the Bedlam Initiative, the London outbreak, and every experiment the company has run across 3 games. The question that immediately follows is, how long has the Meyer been there? Not in Moorcroft's lab. In the world, underground, beneath ocean floors, accessible to anyone with a drill that goes deep enough, existing in the planet's geology the way oil and natural gas exist in the planet's geology, waiting to be found by whoever happened to drill deep enough first. And the second question that follows is where it came from in the first place. Because a substance that exists naturally at geological depth that rewrites biology at a level conventional science cannot fully explain, that produces creatures classified as an entirely separate enemy category from anything Horzine built, does not sound like something that originated on this planet. Which brings us to the distinction that changes how you understand every Meyer creature in the game. The game separates its enemies into two completely distinct categories: Zeds and Mire Entities, not Zeds and enhanced Zeds, not Zeds and boss variants. Two separate labels for two fundamentally different things. And that difference is not cosmetic. It is telling you something important about the nature of the Meyer itself. Zeds are bioengineered humanoids made by Horzine. Every single one traces back to something human that was modified or twisted by the company's research program. The Clot came from a dead child's genetic material. The Stalkers came from what the community believes was Rachel Clamley's genetic material used without her knowledge. The Fleshpound came from an adrenaline pump originally designed to keep a failed clone alive that ended up amplifying its rage, past any containment system's ability to manage. Every Zed has a human origin somewhere in its history. A person, a decision, a laboratory. Something that connects it back to the world Horzine operates in. Mire entities do not have that. They are not Horzine products. They are not modifications of existing biology. They are something that exists within or emerges from the Meyer itself, rather than being created by applying the Meyer to something else. And when you look at them closely, something interesting becomes apparent. Many Meyer entities resemble existing Zed types, but distorted, pushed further, as if whatever process produces them is taking the template of something that already exists and running it through a filter that makes it more of what it already was. A Meyer clot is still recognizable as a clot, but wrong in ways that are hard to articulate, harder to kill, moving differently, carrying something in its biology that the regular version does not have. I find that genuinely unsettling when I think about what it implies. If the Meyer entities here, on this side of whatever barrier separates this world from the Dreadzone, are distorted reflections of creatures that already exist, what does the Dreadzone produce natively on its own side? Not reflections of something from here, its own originals, things that did not need a Horzine lab or a human genetic template to come into existence. Things that the Meyer entities we fight might themselves be pale reflections of. The oil rig is where all of these threads come together and where the full picture of what the Meyer actually is finally becomes clear. A routine drilling operation in the North Sea struck Meyer. Not a small deposit, something significant enough that Moorcroft immediately seized the rig personally with his followers the moment he learned about it. Not as a Horzine operation, as his own. Because he needed that specific location and that specific Meyer deposit for what he had been building towards since before Antarctica. The phrase "an even larger rift" in the official Season 4 description is worth sitting with carefully. An even larger rift implies a smaller rift already existed somewhere. Moorcroft's experiments in Antarctica were not just preparation for a future rift. They were the opening of an initial connection to the Dreadzone. Something smaller, more controlled. A first contact with whatever exists on the other side of a barrier the rest of the world did not even know was there. Moorcroft had already touched the Dreadzone before Season 4 began. What he found there. What came through that initial, smaller connection. What he experienced on the other side of that first contact at the bottom of the world in an abandoned research base on the Brunt ice shelf. That is what pushed him from a scientist studying a fascinating substance into a man willing to merge with his own experiments and place himself between nightfall and a dimensional rift on an oil rig in the North Sea, He did not transform himself because he was desperate. He transformed himself because he had seen what was on the other side and believed it was worth everything it cost to reach. And the oil rig, saturated with naturally occurring mire from the drilling operation that accidentally struck it, was the most powerful connection point to the Dreadzone that Moorcroft had ever found. The place where the barrier between this world and whatever lies beyond it was thinnest. The place where he could finally open something large enough to matter. Not reflections of something from here, its own originals, things that did not need a Horzine lab or a human genetic template to come into existence. Things that the Mire entities we fight might themselves be pale reflections of. What the Dreadzone actually contains, the franchise has not confirmed, and I want to be honest about that rather than dressing up theory as fact. What we know for certain is that it is an alternate dimension, that it is connected to the Mire, that Moorcroft was trying to open a rift large enough to swallow whole cities, and that what comes through such a rift would represent a threat at a scale the franchise has never attempted before in its lore. What we do not know is what specifically lives there, what it looks like, whether it has a landscape, an ecosystem, an intelligence pressing toward this world with purpose, or simply the natural pressure of a dimension whose connection to ours has been widening for as long as the Mire has existed at geological depth. But here is what the evidence points toward when you look at all of it together. The Mire exists naturally in this world as a bleed-through from the Dreadzone, a substance that exists at the intersection between two dimensions, seeping through at geological depth wherever the barrier between them is thinnest. Mire entities are creatures that emerge from or are native to the Mire's influence, separate from anything Horzine built, suggesting the Dreadzone has its own ecosystem that produces its own life independently of anything on this side. And if that is true, the Dreadzone is not an empty void Moorcroft wanted to reach for abstract scientific reasons. It is a dimension full of things that have been pressing against the barrier between worlds for longer than anyone in this story has been alive. Things that do not need a laboratory to exist. Things that the Mire entities we fight here are only the furthest edge of. The creatures that exist closest to the barrier and bleed through it most easily. What lives deeper in the Dreadzone, further from the barrier, further from any connection to this world's biology, is something the franchise has not shown us yet. Year 2 might. There's one more thread worth pulling before we wrap up. Moorcroft's transformation and what it implies about what he actually experienced on the other side. He merged with his own experiments, became what the game calls the ultimate doomsday weapon. And the language the franchise uses to describe why he did it is interesting. After his experiments failed to stop Nightfall's year-long pursuit, Moorcroft decided to handle things directly. Not sacrifice himself to power the rift, not open the connection and let whatever is in the Dreadzone come through on its own. Handle things directly, which implies he still believed, even at the moment of his own transformation, that he was making a tactical decision rather than a desperate last act. A man who had already touched the Dreadzone through his initial, smaller Antarctic rift, who had seen something on the other side that convinced him the transformation was worth it. Who believes so completely in what the Mire represented that becoming it was not an ending, it was a next step? What did he see in that first contact with the Dreadzone that made all of this feel not just justified, but necessary? That is the question this franchise needs to answer. Because Moorcroft is defeated, the rift on the oil rig was presumably stopped or at least contained, but the Dreadzone still exists. The Mire still exists naturally in the world's geology, in deposits nobody has mapped and nobody is monitoring. The smaller rift that Moorcroft opened in Antarctica is completely unaccounted for, and whatever was pressing against that barrier from the other side has not stopped pressing just because the scientist trying to help it through is gone. That is what the Mire, the oil rig, and the Dreadzone actually are when you look at all of it together. Not a substance Horzine created, a geological phenomenon connected to an alternate dimension that predates every experiment the company has ever run. Not an empty void Moorcroft wanted to reach for abstract reasons. a dimension with its own ecosystem whose creatures bleed through into this world as Mire Entities, wherever the barrier between dimensions is thin enough to allow it. Not a crisis that ended when Moorcroft was defeated. An ongoing connection between two worlds that the franchise has now confirmed exists and has not explained how to close. The Killing Floor franchise started with a father in a basement trying to clone his dead son. It has arrived at the edge of an alternate dimension full of things that do not need a Horzine lab to exist. Year 2 has a lot to answer for. Subscribe so you do not miss it, because whatever Tripwire has planned for what comes through that rift next, this series will be covering every detail as it drops. And drop a comment. The Mire was already in the world before Horzine found it, before Moorcroft studied it, before anyone understood what it was connected to. That means the Dreadzone has been pressing against this world for longer than anyone in this story has been alive. How long do you think it has been there? Because the longer I sit with that question, the more unsettling the answer becomes. Tell me what you think.